Hi everybody, welcome back. You guys are doing really good. Had a great holiday. We'll be getting started in about 6 minutes with our class. But for now, anyways, just get comfortable and thanks for attending. We'll get our meeting started and we'll finish up some more of the notes that we have on chapter 9. Hey Megan, how's it going? Good afternoon. Hi Sebastian. I'm good. It was nice to get a little time back during the holiday, and kind of wrapping up the semester is always nice as we get closer to the end. There's a little bit more time to breathe and just chill, so it's a nice time of the semester, definitely. Okay. Hey Jade, how's it going? Hey Bianca, how's it going? Hey there. Hey Rose. Hey there, Nee, how's it going? My holiday, it was nice. It was just a small group, about 4 of us that, like, we didn't travel or anything. These are like local family members that I live close by to, and so we kind of had a distanced kind of gathering with a small little group, but it was nice. Not a lot of good food and some nice time to share together. I didn't cook as much this year as maybe I usually do, so that was also, I guess, sort of nice, even though I don't mind cooking. But it was a good holiday for sure. Just a couple more minutes and then we'll get things going. Good, yeah. A lot of us, I think, in a similar scenario for sure, Sebastian, this year. Yeah, I know some people that took risks flying and trying to gather and travel and stuff, but this isn't the year for it, for me anyway, so we'll hold off, I guess, and then next year, be a little bit more back to normal. that vaccine comes out, I'm sure there's going to be a pretty big vaccination campaign for the whole country, and that'll dictate that we have a new status quo. Hey there, Ryan. How's it going? Good to see you there. Okay, just about another minute. Oh, nice. Yeah, Friendsgiving. I've had such a thing in the past when I was in grad school and not able to get together with the whole family. Yeah, sometimes a small gathering can be really nice. So just one other person or so, a couple people. All right, everyone. Well, it's pretty much 4 o'clock, so I'm just going to let it start going. Welcome back, all you guys, to the meeting and to some of our last lectures of the semester. So basically, we are going to resume where we left off last time and continue through these notes on Chapter 9, which has to do with ethics and the morality and such topics as that. We had a little break during the Thanksgiving holiday, just a full week off. And so what I want to do is, we're going to have these 2 lectures this week on Chapter 9, and then we're going to hold 2 review sessions next week to get you guys prepared for the final exam. And, those 2 review sessions, they'll be posted for everybody. Hopefully many of you can attend and participate and get your questions answered and hear the information live. But if you can't, then you'll be able to watch the video and you'll be prepared for the test that way. I'll distribute the study guide for that final exam middle or later in the week, so you'll be able to get started looking at it in preparation for the review sessions to come next week. But that means that we're just basically going to have 2 class sessions this week, as we have throughout the semester, on one more, well, the same chapter that we introduced before we left, and that's Chapter 9. So that's our plan. I also notified everybody checking in your class announcements that I finished the grading for the other assignments. So everything's been graded all the way up till now. So anybody that is still looking for any scores, I really do invite you to just send me an email, and I'll be happy to give you back your total grade, and you'll see where you stand, and you can know what you did on all the assignments. Many of you have asked for those, and have been able to provide all the responses that I've gotten so far, but there's probably some others that would still like to know about their grade. If you do, just let me know, and I'm happy to let you know in an email exchange. I like to do that. There's various reasons. Sometimes when you have a lot of information that's digital or online, it could be breached, hacked, deleted. So I just prefer to keep physical records and my own electronic records, and then to be the source that you would contact for any checking on your grade. Will there be extra credit? Well, Jasmine, earlier in the semester, there was an opportunity for extra credit with voting. So, yeah, I'm thinking about that question, though. And if I can make a decision about something reasonable that's small, then I'd be open to it. So let me think over these next few days, and maybe when we open up the meeting on Thursday, I can let you know what I've decided for that. Can you still submit your sticker? Sure, Sebastian. If you have voted and you've not yet shown me any kind of documentation that you voted, I'm happy to give you 5 points of extra credit if you can simply forward me your verification. That could be your voting sticker. It could be the screenshot of the Secretary of State's website where you can simply check to make sure your ballot was counted. So you have options for that. Okay, guys, so let's get back into it then. And as usual, if you have questions about any of the things we're discussing or comments to add, that's always great. So put it in the chat and I'll take on all the comments and questions as they come. Okay, so let me just sort of get us back oriented into this subject that we're learning about. This is all on the new chapter, the last chapter we're studying, Chapter 9, and that's ethics. So ethics is the study of what? It's the study of morality and moral concepts. So when we think about the concept of morality, for example, what's right or wrong? what's good or bad, what people should or should not do in a moral sense. Moral and immoral, just and unjust, virtuous versus vicious. There's a lot of different moral distinctions and concepts. And whenever we make judgments about the moral quality of an action or a policy or a type of practice, whatever the case is, then we're engaged in moral reasoning. So moral reasoning is when you or I or just any reasonable human being makes a judgment about what they think is right or wrong or what they should or shouldn't do. So thinking about morality is an important part of human life. We're always going to be subject to moral judgment, and we're always going to be capable of making such moral judgments. Of course, human beings that we are, we have highly developed legal and criminal justice systems that give voice to our shared sense of morality. We're the only animals, of course, that don't just live by the law of the jungle, where it is merely survival of the fittest, but we have laws that protect people against predation, against exploitation, harm, and all kinds of fraud. So we are moral creatures, human beings are, especially among all living things. We have, religion, we have norms, mores, social codes. So this is an interesting and fruitful subject of investigation as much as anything else in our class. One thing that's true about thinking through ethics is that people are quite resistant to considering differences of opinion to their own ethical views. And so by thinking a little bit more explicitly about the concept of moral reasoning and ethics, maybe we'll also be able to have a more open mind. So we also talked about last time, and this is just me reviewing the previous meeting, we talked about the difference between different types of moral action, that some actions are claimed as morally impermissible, which means they're wrong and they're not okay to do. And there's all kinds of actions that would fit in that category, like murder, theft, genocide, rape, torture, all kinds of bad stuff. But also just more minor things like lying, breaking promises, and so forth. There's another category, morally permissible actions. Those are actions that are not wrong and they are okay to do. So, that could be anything from just brushing your teeth in the morning to intervening to stop a robbery, or like helping someone cross the street, donating blood, working at a food bank. Things that no one would claim are blameworthy actions. So that could be things that are noble and helpful. They could also just be things that don't cause harm and that don't create any kind of victim. So anyway, that's morally permissible. And then there's also morally obligatory actions, which are actions that are thought to be morally mandatory instead of just optional. So these are actions that, morally speaking, you must do, and it would be wrong not to do them. I guess like keeping a promise or a vow, not performing any of the morally impermissible actions, so that you're obligated to omit those actions. For example, I could imagine a good clear case would be like returning payment for a service or good that's already been provided to you by some kind of vendor or business. Anyway, so morally obligatory. Questions remain, well, what makes an action fit into any of these different categories? And we'll look a little bit deeper at moral theories that try to answer that question in the following meeting and today. So we, after that, started to just talk about what are different types of values that are discussed within ethics, and we contrasted moral values versus non-moral values. Moral values are basically values that are beneficial to you, but they're also beneficial to other people with whom you might interact. So the other thing about the moral values is that they're considered to be good for their own sake in and of themselves, even if they don't necessarily always lead to some kind of productive or worthwhile result. So we're talking about values like forgiveness, justice, altruism. In all those cases, if that's a value that motivates or inspires your actions or behavior, then it's going to be a good thing for you to have that value within. And it's also going to be a benefit to those who are shown the kind of behavior that follows from having those values. And even if, for example, the occasional misfire happens where you treated someone fair and just, or you forgave somebody, but it still didn't really make the situation better for you, we would still look at it as a good thing that you even had the value in the first place, even if sometimes things don't work out in your favor, even when you have them. Then there's the non-moral values. Non-moral values are, on the other hand, like goal-oriented. So they're thought of as, sometimes they're called instrumental values. They're valued, but only as a means to an end. Only valued as a means to the end of attaining happiness. So that could be stuff like fame, popularity, prestige, wealth. You want those things, and those are values that, of course, we do have. but they're only really cared about because we think that they lead to a benefit for us. So it's not like we want to help everybody else by being famous or wealthy necessarily, but if you have those other goals, then it's coming from the other kind of moral values that you hold. Okay, and it's just emphasized in the text, and I think throughout ethics, that you should try your best to have a healthy dose of both kind of values that motivate and inspire your action. It's also something that leads to a deeper sense of self-contentment. So we should be mindful of that. Okay, now after that, I think we kind of just refer to the conscience. The conscience, if you do remember, is like some internal innate source of knowledge about what's right and wrong. So human beings kind of have a moral sense, a moral sensibility that we're basically born with, but it can either be developed through our early childhood moral education and upbringing, or it can be somehow defective from birth, like if you have a psychological abnormality like you're sociopathic or whatever, or it could also be something that's not nurtured in the proper way and therefore doesn't fully develop. Kind of like the ability to learn language, which is also innately possible for a human, but it won't work out if the environmental triggers don't provide for it. Okay, I think now we can get into some new topics along the same lines. So from there, the text mentions the idea of moral sentiments. So moral sentiments are just emotions that we can have sometimes, and they alert us to the presence of a moral situation, and they cause us to want to do what is right within that situation. So moral sentiments. So kind of in relation to the conscience, there are certain emotions that we sometimes feel that are triggered by the awareness that we are now witnessing kind of moral significance, situation where you think something wrong is happening here, or maybe you feel like something very praiseworthy and righteous is happening here that deserves credit. Whether it's positive or negative, moral sentiments can be felt, and they are when we find ourselves in these kind of moral situations. One of them that's mentioned in the book here is moral outrage. So moral outrage is when you witness or perceive something that you take to be unjust, and you just become upset because of that. So when you perceive an injustice and then become upset, like become aggrieved because of that. All right, so it's a familiar feeling to anybody who has felt like a sense of injustice or miscarriage of what's right at some event or practice in the world. I could think of one example just off the top of my head. Go back to the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s here in the United States, and it's closely following the segregation and Jim Crow era, and basically at one point, we may know this, that there was a system in place on public buses where if you were a black patron of the bus and you're seated close to the front of the bus, and then a white customer, got on, if there were no available seats in the front, then the expectation was that a black, citizen would yield their seat, allow the white patron to sit there, and then move to the back of the bus. Which you can imagine if this were the current day standard, or if this was something done to you, that you would probably feel a sense of indignation at having been treated like a second-class citizen with fewer privileges in society and not a fully equal member. So people like Rosa Parks, for example, led the Montgomery bus boycotts, which called attention to this and eventually led to the reforms. And that's just one of the seminal events in the, interesting couple of decades that kind of spearheaded the Civil Rights era, leading later to the Civil Rights Act, signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson, and many of the other, reforms that have made our society much more equal and diverse and inclusive than it was back then. But if you had been a person that saw this kind of practice and you felt that's wrong, I'm upset, I'd like to maybe do my part if possible to correct this injustice or wrong, then that's the feeling of moral outrage. There's a sort of close cousin to moral outrage in the realm of moral sentiments here that's also talked about in the book. So I want to distinguish these two from each other very quickly. There's also resentment. Resentment is just kind of like a more personal version of moral outrage, because with resentment, it is you directly who are the victim of the unjust behavior or treatment. So resentment, it's a bad feeling that results when you yourself are the one that's treated unjustly. So okay, when you yourself are the direct victim or target of some unjust behavior or practice, then you would experience the moral sentiment of resentment. So using, I guess, the same example just now, you can imagine in the time of the Civil Rights era that if you had even been a person not directly disenfranchised or marginalized by the busing, two-tiered busing system, like say you'd just been in the majority, like a white person, not subjected to that type of racial discrimination, you still could have, and in fact many people did, take up the cause of being an ally to those that were discriminated against. So you could still feel moral outrage on the behalf of those that you think are being treated unjustly or oppressed. But if you had been yourself, like a black citizen, a black American at the time, then it would have been a little bit more personal. It would have been resentment because you yourself are now the one that's been treated according to a double standard. So there are of course endless examples of the phenomenon that we're talking about, and it doesn't have to be just located in the past. In the present day, there's been a lot of, for example, social justice protests happening this year, and not just this year. There's been a lot of talk about this over the past decade or even 20 years, all the way going back, I think, to the Rodney King tapes in early 90s that led to the LA riots. So, whatever time period you want to specify, you could think that people that are out there marching, if they're upset at what they perceive to be unjust treatment on the behalf of, I don't know, some law enforcement officers or some people who seem to be profiled or whatever, or treated with greater suspicion. There are lots of people that are not themselves in the category that might be subjected to that kind of bad treatment. And that would be people feeling moral outrage. But of course, there's also a lot of citizens that might be falling victim to that. So they may feel resentment. Me, myself, I guess I'm not obviously a target for racism or sexism. It's just part of the fact of who I am. But I certainly do feel a sense of allyship and concern for whatever injustices may be perpetrated against people of whatever description. So giving you some examples to sort of reinforce the material in the book. Okay, so let's go on. There's more of these moral sentiments, so we're still focused on that, and there's a couple more items to include. So I'm going to erase those two since we now discussed that. Okay, so there's also compassion, and let's talk about that. Actually, wait, I should mention empathy first because of the way that the book defines the concept, so bear with me. Let's do empathy. Empathy is just this ability to imagine and care about the feelings of others, okay? So Okay, the ability to imagine and care about the feelings of others. So if you are in tune with your conscience and the moral sentiments, then sometimes one of them that you do experience is empathy, and it's a feeling of kind of having an emotional alignment with what someone else is currently experiencing. So the way it kind of plays out is that if someone else is happy, you are happy because you sense that and you kind of relate to it. Or if another person is really sad, then you become upset at their sadness, right? So it's kind of like feeling what others feel, being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and not just to be able to like imagine it, wow, they're suffering, but to kind of care about it and to have a sense yourself of the feeling of loss or disappointment, or on the other end, happiness or satisfaction at a good event or outcome. So it's good to be in touch with other people. We sometimes want people to care about us and to understand what we're feeling and going through. But life is a two-way street, and people are sometimes going to be a little bit more open-minded to and more receptive to your feelings when you're also willing to allow yourself to feel and care about those of others. Closely connected to empathy, and I was going to mention it first, but then I caught myself, is compassion. Now, the way that the book refers to compassion is like just empathy, but based on action. So it's kind of like empathy in action, when you actually do something to improve on a person's feeling if you think they're sad, or joining in to their joy and happiness if they're feeling good. So it's just empathy in action. Okay, so like you see that people are homeless and you feel badly because you can see their life is difficult, and compassion might lead you to actually devote some of your time or energy towards improving their status quo, working at a food bank or homeless shelter, or providing advocacy for that cause legally or something else. So we have these feelings, and when we do something about them, then we're acting in a way that's compassionate. So that's another thing referred to in the text here. While we're going through some of the more positive moral sentiments, we start off, I guess, more on the negative side, talking about, not negative in the sense that they're bad or that you shouldn't experience them, because you have to be in touch with both positive and the negative moral sentiments to have a realistic picture of what's going on in the world. But we started with moral outrage and resentment, and then we talked about empathy and compassion. Also, I guess on the brighter side, there's helper's high, or at least that's the term used in the book. I kind of felt in my mind that might have not been the best label, because it almost sort of associates this positive feeling by helping others with like an intoxication effect, like using a drug, hence the word high. But anyway, I guess the reason that is used as a term is because there actually is some scientific evidence to indicate that when you are helpful to other people and you do something that benefits them, that can actually trigger a chemical release of endorphins in the brain that makes you feel more confident and content. So helper's high is that feeling when you help others and then you feel good about yourself as a side effect of that. So, I've mentioned this before, and I think it's something that, bears repeating, and that is that human beings are very much social animals. Like, we are the quintessential social animal because of the way that we form social bonds, societies, institutions that outlast our lives, criminal justice systems, technology, government, and on and on and on, religion. So we are social animals. We are right now not able to gather in the same way that we're all used to, but this world was not just built by hunter-gatherers just taking care of themselves and their families. It's a technologically advanced and modern society because of the way that we work cooperatively in concert with each other. So there's actually some evidence to show that there may even be kind of like a built-in biological mechanism that rewards us for being helpful to other people. So, bees maybe work together to build colonies. maybe beavers and stuff can work cooperatively to build dams, or ants can build little ant colonies. But only humans can invent the very highly specialized systems that we have been able to achieve in all that technology. So we're social animals, and the fact that we actually do experience some kind of positive reward mechanism in the brain by being helpful, at least a normal, well-adjusted person will experience that. That's further evidence, I think, to underline this point that human beings are social animals. And that's something that's been mentioned and argued for as far back as, you know, ancient Greek, Aristotle, and other thinkers in the early West. So, okay, helpers high. So next, let's swing back over to the sort of darker side of these moral sentiments and talk about guilt and shame. And I'll tell you, I guess, about the difference between the two. So sometimes we feel guilt. And what is that exactly? Well, guilt is a bad feeling, but when we have it, it's telling us that we did something wrong, maybe even that we should try to correct the wrong. So it's a bad feeling that alerts us to and motivates us to correct a wrong. Sorry, I wanted to say alerts us to first. So if I may, a bad feeling that alerts us to and motivates us to correct a wrong. All right, so, you know, none of us would, I would argue, are morally perfect. Each one of us can and probably has done some stuff that we regret or that we feel badly about afterwards. Sometimes you're tempted by the allure of some benefit to you to transgress your own moral code. And when you do that, guilt will kick in. So guilt is that familiar bad feeling, that kind of gnawing at you feeling that you've done something wrong and that maybe you should try to make amends for the wrong, or at least do something to rectify the situation. Now, one thing about guilt is that a lot of times a general reaction that people have to it is hostility and resistance. Like, people will say, why are you trying to give me a guilt trip? You know, don't guilt me. As if it's a bad thing that you even are capable of feeling guilt. But it's not a bad thing. A person that feels guilt is in touch with morality. They're in touch with their sense of right and wrong. So take the opposite extreme. What is a person who feels no guilt, no matter what they do, no matter how badly they behave? Someone could, let's say, steal, kill, rape people, you know, torture people and feel nothing. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. I don't feel guilt. If that was the case, you'd be a psychopath, okay? You'd be a sociopath. So on the far extreme of a, you know, tough guy that thinks I don't, you know, care about any of the bad stuff I'm doing, is a person that nobody should want to be, because that is seriously unhealthy. And it's not a good way for you to win in life. I mean, if you want to have relationships and if you want to have durable, meaningful connections to people, then you can't be the sort of person that just can do wrong things and feel nothing and not even care. So this is not to say, on the other hand, that you should be, you know, obsessed with and consumed by the feeling of guilt for even small transgressions. But you shouldn't seek to silence it completely, because when you're doing that, you're basically trying to crowd out the voice of your own conscience. And that's something important, and it's telling you something important, so you shouldn't just sort of push it to the back of your mind. Guilt is one thing, but something that's a little different, that's often confused with it, is shame. Okay, so shame, maybe I gotta erase this to get the full amount of space, so. Shame is just a bad feeling that results from violating a social norm, okay? Okay, so when you violate a social norm, that's when you're going to feel sometimes like awkward, embarrassed, you know, not normal or whatever, because you've acted in a way that steps outside of the norms. and the expectations of the society that you're in at that time. But the thing is, shame is not exactly the same thing as guilt. Let's see if anybody can figure out why. How could a person, based on these definitions, feel shame but not guilt? If what? If they, for example, did what kind of thing? What do you think could be the answer to that question? What is the possible case of shame but not guilt? In what sort of situation? Anybody? Any takers? What do you think? Not too tough, I think, to contemplate this. But let's see if anyone can throw something back. Aaron, if they did the right thing, but it was not socially acceptable. Okay, that's one case. That's an interesting case. So like maybe somebody did what their conscience demanded they do, but it was like considered weird or out of line to a group that's judging them socially. I can imagine a case like that, sure. Eduardo, you say guilt acts on what they did wrong. That's correct. Yeah, so you'd feel shame perhaps without guilt if you did something that was considered like socially abnormal, but at the same time, it's not really immoral. Okay, so you didn't do anything wrong, but you just did something that's taboo or considered outside this convention or norm. Like, I don't know, imagine that you were like in a social situation where everyone knew at this event that there was a dress code and you're not in that dress code. So like everyone's dressed formally and you're dressed in just like, you know, sweats and stuff like that. Now, you might go into that event and see people kind of snickering at you and talking under their breath about, haha, this guy didn't get the memo or whatever about the way we're supposed to be dressed or what attire we're wearing. So you might feel a sense of shame, but is that guilt? It's not really guilt, because guilt would only kick in if you thought, I'm doing something that's actually wrong here. That's just a case of not doing the thing that's normal in that social environment, but that's a possibility. Now, I guess a little more of a heavier example of this that's mentioned in the book is like, perhaps they take the case of people in the LGBTQ community, maybe in previous generations of American history when there was not the same kind of acceptance and openness that is generally seen in at least younger people today. But, you know, imagining yourself like, I don't know, a gay person back in the 40s or 50s, afraid to disclose your orientation because you know that it's going to be severely criticized or frowned upon by broader society, but feeling in your mind, you know, that you have no control over that, that's just something that you feel that you were born that way, and you just find yourself having an attraction to members of the same sex. You could say, well, I'm feeling like a sense of shame because people think this is weird and it's not the norm, but no guilt, because guilt would only come when you made a willful decision that you did something that you knew was wrong. So I don't know, here's the book to just sort of cap this off with some discussion from the book. So it says here, guilt, so on page 274, guilt both alerts us to and motivates us to correct a wrong that we've committed. Guilt is a lot like pain. When you cut yourself, you feel pain at the site where you had the injury. The pain motivates you to repair the injury before it becomes infected. So guilt also motivates you to avoid harming yourself and other people. We refrain from cheating on an exam or from stealing someone's computer, even when no one is around to see us take it, because the very thought of doing it makes you feel guilty. Guilt, and now it continues, is frequently regarded as a barrier to personal freedom and happiness, and some of us respond to guilt with resistance, either trying to ignore it or getting angry at the person who makes you feel guilty. But at the same time, we regard a person who feels no guilt, such as a sociopath, as inhuman and a monster. This uncertainty about the nature of guilt stems in part from a confusion of guilt with shame. Guilt is often broadly defined to include shame. However, the two are different. Guilt results when we commit a moral wrong or violate a moral principle. Shame, on the other hand, occurs as a result of the violation of a social norm or not living up to someone else's expectations for us. And so then they make the mention that teenagers who are lesbian, gay, bisexual may feel shame for not living up to the expectations of their family, church, or society, but generally don't feel moral guilt. Rather than motivating us to do better, shame leaves us feeling embarrassed, humiliated, or inadequate. And as good critical thinkers, it's important to know the difference between guilt and shame. So much for that piece of discussion and information from the book there. So the next thing then that's coming out in chapter 9 from this point is there's a discussion of the stages of what are called stages of moral development. So you'll learn that there was actually this well-known Harvard psychologist and researcher named Lawrence Kohlberg, and he did empirical research on the concept of moral development in human beings, and he examined and studied this topic across different cultures globally. So he thought he was getting to the real universal human characteristic of how we develop morally, not just something that we see in one culture or another, but he examined this cross-culturally and internationally, and he thought that he was able to identify a basic pattern according to which human beings can develop in 3 stages of moral development. I don't know why it is, but it seems to me that a lot of researchers and in psychology and such fields use 3 almost like as a magic number. So earlier in the semester we talked about the stages of cognitive development, and it was argued there that there's dualism, relativism, and commitment. And then when the book talked about the critical thinking procedure, it broke that down into 3 basic stages, like there was experience, interpretation, and analysis. So I don't know if it's just because we think in terms of 3s, like beginning, middle, and end, but here again, there's going to be a 3-part breakdown of the stages in which a person can develop morally. Okay, so that's the next thing to talk about. Okay, so here's first of all the information about the psychologist who presented this research. That's Lawrence Kohlberg. So if people ever want to further investigate his ideas, then that would be his name. And he lived from 1927 until 1987. So worked at Harvard as a professor of psychology and a researcher. So he believed, right, that there are these 3 stages of moral development. Okay, 3 stages of moral development. So we'll begin with the first one. So to start off, he calls the first stage the pre-conventional stage. So that's like stage number 1, pre-conventional. And this is like the most basic and rudimentary moral perspective that a person has. You got to think about the way that little children think about morality, or comparatively unsophisticated adults sometimes, if they don't make progress from this stage. But it's the most kind of basic and brute, primitive form of thinking about morality. But basically, here's the idea. At the pre-conventional stage of your moral development, you think that morality is all just about avoiding punishment for yourself. So morality is nothing more than avoiding punishment, or in other words, it's all about avoiding punishment. Okay, so it's kind of a self-centered way of thinking about what's right and wrong. The person at this stage of moral development, they don't really care about doing the right thing because it's right. They do it, if they do, because they're fearful of punishment coming back to them if they violate a rule or a social code. So like at the pre-conventional level of moral thinking, why does a person say, I shouldn't steal? They would think that it's bad to steal, but why? At the pre-conventional level, the only real reason they think it's wrong is because of what? See what you can tell me on that. Pre-conventional moral thinking, moral outlook of basically children and so on. Why would that type of person say I shouldn't steal? What's the reason it's wrong? I think based on the definition, you'll know. Yeah, well, okay, you might get arrested, or maybe the person will catch you in the act and harm you or something right there. Yeah, so you're worried about getting caught, and if you do get caught, a punishment is waiting for you, some type of penalty of whatever kind. It's like little children that say, well, I'm not going to do something bad because my parents could find out and then they could put me on timeout or ground me, or the teacher might see me do it and then they're going to give me detention. it's the kind of person that really doesn't think too much about what's the real deeper moral reason to act in the right way or to avoid wrong behavior. It's just all based on fear of personal accountability. So at that level of moral development, you may do the right things, but for a pretty self-centered reason. And because of that, there's a little graph that the book gives to sort of show the moral orientation of a person here. And it's two spheres, or two circles. One is labeled me, and then the other one is labeled others. And at this point, the circle that signifies me is just much more large. So it's kind of like this way of thinking. At the pre-conventional stage, other people, you don't really care about them for their own sake. You'll treat them well, but only because you're aware that someone out there might do something punitive to you in case you do something bad to the other people. But it's for your own self-interested reasons that you stay in line with the so-called right conduct. Let me read about that here in the book. So it says, so Kohlberg identified, I'll give you a little more background. Many psychologists believe that we progress through different stages of moral development during our lives. According to Harvard psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, people advance through distinct stages in the development of their moral reasoning capacities. These stages are transcultural, that is, they're found in every culture of the world. They give a footnote to his research for you to see his findings on that. But anyway, each new stage represents increased proficiency in critical thinking skills and greater satisfaction with your moral decisions. So Kohlberg identified 3 levels of moral development. In the pre-conventional stage, morality is defined egotistically in terms of oneself. People at this level expect others to treat them morally, but generally they don't treat other people with respect or morality unless doing so benefits them. Most, though not all, people outgrow the pre-conventional stages by high school. Most criminals, though, are still at this stage. Nearly half of all crimes are committed by young people between the ages of 15 and 24. Okay, but what if you continue to develop, grow, take on a deeper perspective in life? Then you'd make it through to the second phase of your moral development. And so this is pre-conventional, stage 1. Stage 2 is just called conventional. Okay, so the conventional stage is next, sorry. So at the conventional stage, you actually, it's kind of like a backlash to the first stage, where now you actually are totally concerned about how to fit into the standards and the norms, the conventions, in other words, that people expect you to. So at this level, it's not that you're doing the right thing because you're afraid of punishment to you. You're doing the right thing now because you want to win the approval of other people. So you want them to judge you as like a nice boy or a good boy or a nice girl. That's the language used in the book. So I'm just borrowing from the book when I say good boy, nice girl. The conventional moral thinking and outlook is, I'm going to stick to what's considered socially approved and socially judged as right because I want to be thought of as a good boy or a nice girl by other members of society. So it's all about fitting into the norms, fitting into the conventions and standards to win the approval of society and its members. So that's the conventional stage of moral thinking. One adheres to social norms and conventions in order to be seen as a good boy or a nice girl. Okay, and the little depiction of these circles that's supposed to give like a visual of the relative priority placed on the self versus others, it just flips here. And so now we see this kind of drawing in the book, sorry, where me is the smaller circle basically and others looms larger. That is because at that stage, you just want to fit into what everybody expects you to do. You want to be perceived as normal, fly under the radar kind of, and just not arouse any negative moral judgments coming from members of society onto you, but it's just because you want to fit in. Now, I'll read about that too. Here's what it says in the book. People at the conventional stage look to others for moral guidance, earning the approval of others and conforming to peer group norms are especially important for people at this stage. For example, and they give an example, Lindy England, one of the American guards in the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq, at her court-martial in 2005, because they were basically being abusive to detainees that were in U.S. custody over there in Iraq, she stated in her defense that she chose to do what the friends at the base wanted her to do. The judge rejected that plea. So she just thought that because I'm in a social environment where this is becoming customary and normal, I don't find that it's wrong because I'm just doing what is judged positively by my peers in this situation. But, you know, if you get to the highest and most developed stage of your moral development, that's the third, Kohlberg said that according to his research anyway, it's something like only 10% of American adults reach this stage, so it's not exactly the majority, but a minority can get there, and let me describe that. That's the post-conventional stage. So you see kind of a pattern. It's pre-conventional, conventional, and then the third one is post-conventional, meaning beyond what's just considered normal in society or conventional. So let me give you that third one now. I have to erase these to show post-conventional. This is a pretty intense red marker. I guess it's just bleeding out, whatever. Maybe I'll switch back to blue. So the third stage. Okay, the post-conventional level of moral development, that's where you start to apply universal moral principles and using your own best moral judgment. So you are the individual now who makes independent moral choices and decisions based on your own principles, but sometimes these conclusions that you reach are going to be even different from the conventional views of society. So you allow yourself here to think independently, to basically come to independent, self-directed moral conclusions using your own moral compass, right? The moral principles that you take to heart and your own good judgment. So instead of just, I'm afraid to get punished and there's no real right or wrong except me not getting punished, instead of just thinking, well, I want to fit in because other people basically have norms and I want to follow them, now you're the one that thinks about, well, what are the right principles? Should I do the thing that's considered conventional or normal, or is that actually contrary to my own moral standards? So you make your own independent moral judgments. Okay, I guess it's got to be the red one because now it's been tainted, and if I use the other colors, they kind of don't bleed through. So anyway. Okay, so post-conventional. You're thinking now not just in terms of what's normal. How do I just do what everyone says is normal? Now you're the person who's kind of the moral judge, who says, well, what should it be that's right? What do I actually believe independently based on my appreciation of moral principles and my critical thinking and intellect? The conclusions that you reach from the post-conventional stage of moral thinking are sometimes breaking off from the norm that other people hold, or sometimes you will come to conclusions that differ from the peer group that you're a part of, right? You say, well, I'm going to strike out on my own, and I see things differently. So that's the highest level of moral development that you can reach, because you don't just take the input from other people and take it as a set fact, nor are you just so narrow-minded in your moral outlook that you're just kind of fearful of punishment and you have no more broad perspective than this. Now, the little circles that we've used to diagram the priority given to the self versus the other in these moral stages, they come into equilibrium here. So they're basically the same size, me and others. The reason that they're balanced out is because at this point you do take the judgments of society and of other people seriously, and you take them on board as advisement for your own perspective, but you balance that against your own individual and independent moral perspective. So there's kind of like a balance and an equilibrium between the two there. Let me read also about this from the book, and that'll help us. So I'm going to turn on an extra light here, 1 second. Okay, yes. So from the book, more on the conventional stage for a minute before I read about this. So back to conventional for a minute. Most high schoolers and high school seniors and college freshmen are at the conventional stage of moral development. But the next stage of conventional moral reasoning involves substituting the norms and laws of the wider culture for pure group norms. Oh, sorry, now I'm getting to it. At the post-conventional stage of moral reasoning, people recognize that social conventions need to be justified. The fact that something is the law does not necessarily make it moral or just. Instead, moral decisions should be based on universal moral principles and on concerns such as justice, compassion, and mutual respect. Okay, so like, if you'd lived in the time of slavery and the law was it's illegal to free a slave, then if your moral perspective was just pre-conventional, you'd be afraid that if you helped to facilitate the escape of slaves, that you could be caught and prosecuted. So you'd be like, well, I won't do it, and I think it's bad because it's against the law. In the second stage, you might think, well, I don't know, what does my immediate peer group think about this? You could have been friends with a bunch of abolitionists or friends with people that defended the institution of slavery, or maybe, depending on the values and mores seen in your community, you just kind of adopt those. But at the post-conventional stage, you'd be thinking independently, like, well, what is the idea of slavery? And what does it mean for a human being to be transferred and sold like their property? Is that really right or wrong? And what do my moral principles tell me about that, independently of what maybe the prevailing mood is in society or the law? So we don't want to take it to the far other extreme, though. It's not like being at the post-conventional stage of moral development means that you just rebel against everyone's sense of right and wrong and you always defy the norm. Oftentimes, these norms exist for a valid reason, and that's because we have a kind of shared sense of right and wrong that is generally accurate. But that doesn't mean that every single law or policy or moral choice that people make is immune from intellectual or moral criticism. And when you're at the post-conventional level, you allow yourself to make those independent and unique moral criticisms based on your judgment. Okay, so last words here. A person's stage of moral development is correlated with his or her behavior. Researchers found that only 9% of people at the pre-conventional stage, 38% of people at the conventional stage would offer help to someone who appeared to be suffering from the side effects of a drug. But all subjects at the post-conventional stage offered their assistance. And he comments, less than 10% of American adults reach the post-conventional level of moral reasoning. But if you don't, then you tend to come up with simplistic solutions to moral dilemmas and problems. And when they don't work or backfire, you become frustrated and baffled. And it just mentions last that people outgrow their old way of thinking when it becomes inadequate for resolving the more complex problems and issues that you encounter in life. And movement to the higher stage is usually triggered by new ideas or experiences that conflict with the worldview that you had before. Okay, and I just want to say this too, as we're going to now move on from the whole stages of moral development discussion. If you look at the book on this, you'll see that they actually try to break down each of the three stages into two subcategories. And in my view, that was just a little bit overly complex and unnecessary. So I just simplified it a bit to you guys by giving you three clean stages. But know this, that if you look in the book, it's going to say like pre-conventional part 1 and 2, conventional part 1 and 2, post-conventional part 1 and 2. But I didn't really think that there was enough substance to the distinction between the two subparts to justify a whole separate discussion. So I've streamlined it a little bit for you there, and just understand that this was not like a oversight on my part. I intended not to, muddy the waters, as it were, with too much arcane, overly complex detail on how to break each of the stages down further more into two parts. But you can see that in the book if you really do want to look at it. Okay, so they talk about how the relative level of moral development that you are at can inform the way you approach, moral decisions and situations in life. So as one case study, college students at different stages of their college education, like some freshmen, some seniors, they would survey their perspective on like a little moral dilemma, like a scenario that was given. And here's what they say in the book. So the situation was, imagine that you live next door to a neighbor, and this neighbor is somebody who everyone loves and really respects, and they seem to be a pillar of the community. They just seem like to be a good person who everyone kind of values and admires, but you learn something about them that you didn't know before. You learn that this person is actually an escaped fugitive, that they're living free from prison, but that they're actually a previous prisoner who escaped and is just living free on the lam, as it were. So what about that? Should we turn the person in? And it says here, well, freshmen were more black and white in their responses. In this study, students were presented with the fictional case of Joe. One day, the neighbor discovers that Joe, that's been living the life of a model citizen for many years, is actually an escaped prisoner. Students were then asked, should the neighbor turn this person in to the authorities? Freshmen were more likely to say yes, because that's the law. But by the time the college students reach their senior year, they're still concerned about the law, but they also started to ask more nuanced questions. For example, would it be fair for the law to be applied in this case? And those that had reached the post-conventional level wanted to know more about Joe. For example, was he rehabilitated? Would reporting or not reporting it to the authorities provide the most benefit to society? So peer relations at college are important in the development of moral reasoning. You basically have to finally encounter people with diverse perspectives that you don't really get exposed to as much in your home environment growing up, where you're kind of insulated from the broad array of different ideas and worldviews that people have. And so discussions of moral issues in classrooms, with your peers, social media, and so forth, challenge your moral preconceptions, and that sometimes helps to facilitate your moral development too. Okay, so the last thing that's in chapter 9, and I'm just going to sort of set this up for our final lecture discussion on this Thursday, is about the different moral theories that exist. So we started this whole chapter 9 discussion by mentioning that there's the category of morally impermissible actions, things that are wrong, in other words, and then there are morally permissible actions, things that are not wrong, versus things that are morally obligatory, things that we would say are morally required. But here's a question. What is the criteria for saying that an action is in one of those cases? Like, what makes an action morally impermissible or permissible or obligatory? Is there any answer to this? Well, you're going to now learn that there actually have been very detailed theories that have been developed in the West which try to give these answers. What makes an action right or wrong, if anything? And there are basically two major types of what are called moral theories. These moral theories try to provide some substance, put a little meat on the bones, to use a metaphor, as to what really is the content of morality and what makes something right or wrong. So there's two main types of moral theory, and let me go over that really fast. It's just the red, it's funny. Okay, all right, back to this. So two types of moral theory. Okay, so one is called moral relativism. And that is to be contrasted with moral universalism. Okay, so first off, moral relativism. Moral relativism basically says that morality is not universal and it's not objective, it's not absolute, but that it somehow is relative to something. Okay, so that's the idea here. Okay, and we'll discuss this in a minute, but let me first give you the other definitions so that we have them both on the board. Moral universalism, as you could probably guess, is just the opposite view. It's the view that morality it's not relative, it's not subjective. Instead, this would be the perspective that it's universal and that it is absolute. That morality, there's objective moral facts. And these facts don't change from person to person, from place to place, or from time to time. That there's just an objective moral code, and it's universal, absolute, and it's the same for every person, place, and time. So there's just like this universal, unchanging, absolute moral code or set of facts. That's moral universalism. So morality is universal and absolute. And that's different from moral relativism. Now, within the topic of moral relativism, there's actually two branches. There's two varieties of moral relativism, okay? So one of the two is ethical subjectivism. Okay, and then let me just define that one first, and then we'll talk about the other. Ethical subjectivism is one type of moral relativism. What it says is that morality is just nothing more than each person's personal opinion. So that's like the most radically relativistic moral framework you could have. According to this view, there's no set fact about what's right and wrong. What's right and wrong just depends on what each individual thinks. So all you can say is, well, to me, this is wrong or this is right. And maybe you have a different view. And according to ethical subjectivism, there's no like fact of the matter. There's just two different moral perspectives. So it's wrong to one person and it's not wrong to the other in a case that you can imagine. Okay, so this says morality is nothing more than personal opinion. Okay, so you know, ethical subjectivism has some appeal, right? It's persuasive to some people, obviously, many people in a way, because we, I think, all have had this message really hammered home over our lives in this kind of current generation and time period that you have to have respect for diverse perspectives, for different people's lifestyles and beliefs, and you shouldn't come down on them too harsh and say, no, what you're saying or believing is wrong. But there can certainly be problems with ethical subjectivism, and I want to mention at least, well, probably the major criticism of it. Maybe you can figure it out just by thinking through it. Can you imagine that there's anything perhaps problematic or troubling about the idea of ethical subjectivism? Does anybody have any just general idea? What could be like problematic about the concept that morality is just personal opinion? What do you think? Any idea about what could be the issue with that? If morality is just personal opinion, do you see anything that's like wrong or to be criticized about that idea? Okay, Aaron, if someone thinks murder is okay, then it is okay for them. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I was going for, right? And if nobody suggested the idea, I was going to lead you to it by means of a question. And I was going to ask that question. The question would be, so, okay, let's suppose we're taking ethical subjectivism as the view. Is murder wrong? Is murder wrong? Well, it's sort of like a trick question because all you can say is, it depends. It depends on what? Well, it depends on who you're speaking with. So I guess for me and you guys, and I'm hoping we can agree at least on this, murder's wrong because we believe that. But talk to the murderer and maybe they'll say something totally different. You know, get into the twisted mind of a murderer and they could say all kinds of weird stuff like, you think murder's wrong? Ah, well, I don't agree. You know, murder is great. It's thrilling. It's like hunting, but it's hunting humans. And humans are the most difficult and most impressive animal to capture and kill. So the thrill of the hunt and the satisfaction of getting it done is immense. And therefore, it's a great source of pleasure. And I think it's actually a good thing. More people should be killing each other. It's like, you know, but that's a weird and twisted, warped perspective, right? We don't want to grant any legitimacy to that. You don't want to say to somebody, well, that's your opinion and let's just agree to disagree, as it were. We shouldn't agree on that point because maybe we want to say something stronger, like, no, it's fundamentally wrong, it's immoral. And if there's some weird deviant people out there that think otherwise, they're just wrong. Something's wrong with them. We don't want to grant, you know, some type of legitimacy or justification to their weird, warped moral perspective, right? I mean, you could even imagine like a rapist could say, well, go back in like evolutionary history, and like a powerful male that could like subdue and overwhelm like a woman with force would more effectively pass on their genes. And so, in a survival of the fittest sense, I don't know, I feel like it's not that. If a person says that, they're giving a weird justification for something that I would argue is clearly immoral and that's universally recognized as such. So ethical subjectivism has that problem, that it denies you the ability to make a strong moral criticism of what is just intuitively recognizable wrong behavior. You can no longer say what you're doing is wrong. You just have to say, well, to me and to the majority it's wrong, and you are a person with a different opinion, but I can't say it's actually wrong because there's no objective fact. Okay? Now, another type of moral relativism, though, which may do a little bit better than this, but it has its own issues, is cultural relativism. So that's the other variety here. Cultural relativism, it agrees on the point that morality is not universal, but where morality derives from is now not located at the level of one individual, but rather the whole society of which the individual is a part. So cultural relativism says that morality depends on the cultural norms and standards of one's society. Okay, maybe I'm just going to erase this bottom so that I have more room, but we'll get to discussion of moral universalism in due time. So yeah, morality depends on the norms and standards or whatever of one's society. Okay, so let's see how this does a little bit of a different job than the ethical subjectivist view. Take cultural relativism, for example. So, according to cultural relativism, let me ask, is murder wrong? What about that? Cultural relativism now. Is it wrong for, somebody to just kill a person walking down the street? Okay, good, Aaron. Yes. Why? What's the reason, though? Before, with ethical subjectivism, we said it depends on who we're talking about or what their view is. Now you're saying, yes, that's wrong from cultural relativism. What's the reason that's wrong? It's correct, but I'm just asking for a little expansion, which I think you know, since you said yes. What could be that reason? Because the culture tells you so, yes, because you're in a culture where there's a law, and so you may be the sick, twisted serial killer that's breaking the law, but you're in a culture that doesn't validate or approve of that behavior. So this is going to at least allow us to say, well, yeah, there's a moral standard that's not just down to one individual. We live in a society, and a society, that we're a small part of is what generates the moral standards and norms that we think apply. But there's still an issue with the cultural relativism, okay? Like, for example, here we go, I don't know. Is it wrong to marry a child? What do you think? We're asking this from the point of view of cultural relativism. Is that wrong? Child marriage? Child bride? What do you think? What's the answer to this one? Just think about it and let me see what you say. In all culture, yes, but not in the past. Okay, that's one thing you can say, Alec. You can say, well, in the past, before we had these, like, the legal age of consent, little children could be married off to a male suitor really young in life. But you can also talk about how there are just current global cultures in which that's an expected norm or a rite of passage. We get into like certain very, indigenous cultures. That can be something that's actually practiced widely. So you could say, well, in our culture, that would be considered like child abuse, and that would be absolutely prohibited and wrong. But in other cultures, they have a whole different view about the time at which a person is to be entering into the institution of marriage, and there's a whole different standard there. But here's the thing, I mean, you may be thinking, well, actually, though, it is wrong, though. Even in the places where they allow it, that whole culture is just doing something wrong. Cultural relativism would deprive you of the ability to make a strong moral criticism of a whole culture when you're not a member of it. Because all you could say is, well, to me and my culture, we think that's wrong. But it's just relative, so there's no actual objective fact here. One culture says bad, another culture says not bad. But if you feel more passionately that some of these things we're talking about are absolutely wrong, and that even if a whole planet did it, that would be like an evil planet, then you have a view that goes beyond either version of relativism, and you're reaching for moral universalism. Because what moral universalism says, as we know, is that moral standards are absolute and universal, and they don't vary. Even if everyone doesn't act the same way, the moral code is just absolute and unified. I don't know, I could give you more examples, like, is human sacrifice wrong? Well, of course you'd think so, especially if it was like a child, but I don't think it's unprecedented that there have been cultures on the planet Earth that have thought that this was an expectation to like appease the gods or something. I mean, even closer to home in our own culture, right? Like killing a woman because she was presumed to be a witch or whatever. There's no moral justification for that. But of course, that was a practice that was considered righteous at one point in time. So relativism can't take you all the way to saying that something is just, as a matter of fact, wrong. No matter who's doing it, no matter where they're doing it, no matter when they're doing it. But some people may be okay with that. You may think that, moral facts don't exist. Morality is just either socially or individually based. But some people do think that there's something a little bit deeper and more universal and timeless about ethics. And for those, if you have those intuitions, then neither version of relativism is really for you, and you'd be thinking more about some kind of moral universalism. So that's what we're actually going to spend all the time talking about on Thursday for the most part. We're going to go over two main moral universalist theories that have been much discussed in the West over the centuries. One of them is by the British philosopher John Stuart Mill, and his theory is called Utilitarianism. And then there's also the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and his moral philosophy is sometimes called just Kantianism, named after him. Other times it's called deontology. But those are two different types of moral universalist theory, and it takes a while to explain the basics of them. So part of the plan on Thursday is I'll talk to you about utilitarian and Kantian ethics. Then I'll tell you a little bit about what are rights and what are different kinds of rights, like the difference between liberty rights and welfare rights. And we'll also mention briefly what is the notion of virtue, what are virtues. Some people think that that is also a key concept in ethics. And that'll be enough for us to finish up the class with our material on Thursday as we prepare for the final and the review sessions that come next week. Okay, so yeah, that should be about it, I guess, for today. Make sure that you take time to do your homework between now and next Tuesday when it's due. If you have any questions about that, let me know. It's just, like I said, you have to record the exact time that each story occurs for. So you have to have like a time measurement device, a stopwatch of some kind, and you have to itemize all the stories in a list together with a one-sentence description and the amount of time. And separate from that, you'll have your like 2-page document where you go into like critical analysis of whatever you thought could be found fault in terms of the broadcast itself. So whether it was bias, fallacy, rhetoric, manipulative language, the use of editing, anything that shapes the viewer's experience or conceals facts or other perspectives should be mentioned. You'd use 12-point font. It could be double-spaced, but if you need to go beyond 2 pages, that's also fine. And that's your last homework, which will be due again next Tuesday. I'll turn around and make sure to grade it quickly, and then you'll know how you're doing so you can perform well in the final. All right, guys, so I think that for now, we're good to go. Are you guys all good? Let me know in the chat, or just hit the like button, or just say something to me so I know that we're on the same page. If so, when I get that little feedback, I'll let you guys go and we'll be good for today. So what's up? Any questions? Anything that I didn't mention? No? Okay. Well, when is the final? Let me. I have to look back at the syllabus, but it's all 29 of you hit like. That's funny. Well, anyway, yeah. Sorry. Let me look at the syllabus again because it's printed there, and you'd see the accurate date on the syllabus and the accurate time. But I'll give you an announcement also to the whole class so that that's totally unambiguous between now and Thursday. Okay, guys. Well, again, have a good one, and I will see you back on Thursday. Take care.